Chapter 2. Let's go. So we finished with Chapter 1 already, obviously, and now we are entering Chapter 2, The Shadow of the Past. So Chapter 2 starts off with a reference already from Chapter 1, saying that the story of Bilbo's disappearance didn't die down after 9 or even 99 days. It was talked about for a year and a day. It also says that the story of the disappearing Mad Baggins, who used to vanish with a flash and reappear with bags of gold and jewels, was told to Hobbit children for unknown lengths of time. In the meantime, the opinion of most people in the Shire was that Bilbo's just crazy, and he went off into the woods, and somewhere he must have fallen into a river or a pool and drowned, and that's why he's gone. And this was all done at the behest of Gandalf. And so this also led to a lot of those hobbits saying that they sure wish Gandalf would leave Frodo alone as well, so that Frodo can just go and live his life and settle down and gain some hobbit sense, as they say. To them, it looked like Gandalf did, in the end, leave Frodo alone. He started coming around less, and we'll later see exactly how long it has been since Gandalf has seen Frodo. But Frodo did seem to inherit Bilbo's penchant for oddity, as many of the people who live in the Shire pointed out. Frodo would continue to throw birthday parties for both he and in Bilbo's honor, and people would always ask him why, and he'd say, well, because he's still alive, and they'd ask him where he is, and he'd shrug his shoulders and say, I don't know. So he lived alone, just as Bilbo had done, but he, in living alone, would have a number of friends who regularly visited his house. If you are familiar with the movies, these two names you will not know, and that is Falco Boffin and Frederick Bulger were two who frequented Bag End. The others are the two that we know. Peregrine Took, who's usually called Pippin, and Merry Brandybuck, whose real name is Meriadoc, but nobody really remembers that, and nobody calls him by Meriadoc. Frodo would wander all over the Shire with these little young hobbits. They were significantly younger than Frodo was himself. Merry and Pippin, though, would suspect that whenever Frodo went off alone, without any of them, that he would go and visit the elves the same way Bilbo had done. After a while, some of the hobbits started noticing Frodo had acquired Bilbo's well-preservedness, and he also appeared to not be aging at all. Them saying that some people just have all the luck. Frodo really enjoyed being the new master of Bag End. He found it very pleasant. But he would sometimes regret that he didn't join Bilbo on their journey. And on some of his solo walks, he would look out past to where he normally would walk and say, someday I'll cross this river, but not today. This continued through Bilbo's 30s, which is, he was 33 when we left him, and then also through his 40s up till his 50th birthday. He started feeling that a lot of these trails that he had been walking on were a little too well trodden, and he was looking at the maps in the Shire usually just have white space past the Shire, so Frodo would walk and would wonder what is past these white spaces. Along with that, Frodo was seen often talking with strange people who were visiting the Shire at the time. Strange wayfarers, it says, notably not hobbit folk. At this point, it had been many years since Frodo had seen or even heard from Gandalf, and the elves, who usually don't walk through the Shire, are now seen going in larger groups on their way to the Grey Haven. Along with them were numerous groups of dwarves leaving the Iron Hills and the Lonely Mountain area and traveling to the Blue Mountain, just past the Shire. And it's these dwarves where Frodo started getting most of his news from, and a lot of that news contained what the book calls whispers of the land of Mordor. Mordor is a name that the hobbits really only know in the sense of legends and stories. Some of the stories being similar to those that Bilbo told of the White Council, banishing a spirit of Mordor from Mirkwood, which lines up with his travels abroad. There was no news that the Dark Tower in Mordor had been rebuilt, that orcs as well were multiplying, and that trolls were wandering around from their caves, no longer dull-witted like the trolls in Bilbo's story that he encountered. So we get a scene change, and we have what is somewhat of a recapitulation of what we had in the first chapter, where we have all the older men in this tavern called the Ivy Bush talking about strange happenings, but those strange happenings were Bilbo's party and things about Bilbo. Whereas at this point, we are having the children of those old men inside another tavern called the Green Dragon, but the Green Dragon is in Bywater, not in Hobbiton. And they are going to be talking about strange goings on. In this, we have Sam essentially in a debate with Ted Sandyman, the miller's son, where Sam is talking about how strange things are happening, and he brings up that his cousin Hal had seen a walking tree up in the North Moors, and Ted Sandyman tells him that clearly he didn't, because had he seen a tree, Ted Sandyman tells him that clearly his cousin didn't, because trees can't walk, therefore your cousin didn't see that. Ted kind of uses comedy in his rebuts of Sam's claims, causing a lot of laughter of the other hobbits, making it seem like Ted is scoring points in this debate just because of laughter. Then we have a scene here of Sam waxing poetic of the elves wandering off, and they're walking through the Shire on their way to the Grey Havens, and they're leaving. Why are the elves leaving? Things of that nature. Ted then rebuts that with, well, Sam, I can guarantee you've never seen one. And Sam says, no, I haven't, but Mr. Frodo has. Which then leads to Ted saying, well, Frodo's crazy. Well, at least Bilbo was crazy, and Frodo is getting crazy. And with that, Ted seems a little bored of the conversation, so he just leaves, and he leaves the bar, tells everyone good night. And so Sam is left sitting there by himself, thinking about the things that he has to do in the morning. And that's an interesting thing. I have a theory that Sam had been put up to spy on Frodo by Merry and Pippin. We will see more, I believe, proof of this later, but I just want to put my theory out there. When we get to it, and we won't see the actual outcome of this until Chapter 5, A Conspiracy Unmasked. That's where we will really see the fruits of this theory, but I just wanted to throw my first hint of that out there. So it's as Sam is sitting here pondering at the bar that Gandalf decides to come back to visit Hobbiton. Well, to visit Frodo. That evening when Gandalf visits, he doesn't really talk about his business at all. He only talks to Frodo about like the small doings of the Shire, what's new in Frodo's life, things like that. He remarks that Frodo looks the same as ever, kind of pointing to that well-preservedness. Frodo replies, so do you. Lying and secretly thinking to himself that Gandalf looked older and more careworn. We get a brief scene change, or a quick scene change, the next morning, where they're having breakfast. And Gandalf is sitting by the window, smoking in silence, and Frodo was sitting deep in thought, to the point where he finally asks, he says, last night you were talking to me about something, but you said it was best to save it and not discuss this at night. So it's about time we start talking about it. What's going on? So we have Gandalf start to give a history of Elven rings, saying in Eregion long ago, Elven rings were made magic rings, as you call them, and they were, of course, of various kinds, some more potent, some less. The lesser rings were only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and the Elven smiths, to the Elven smiths, they were but trifles. Yet still, to my mind, dangerous for mortals. But the great rings, the rings of power, they were perilous. So we're starting to get an introduction now to what this ring is that Frodo has. Gandalf tells him that if a mortal continues to wear this ring, he not only becomes invisible, but actually fades and becomes permanently invisible and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the ring. So you essentially stop existing in the material world, in the physical realm. Frodo, of course, at this point is a little scared and asks Gandalf how long he's known this and if Bilbo knew about this. Gandalf, of course, tries to calm him down about worrying about Bilbo. He said Bilbo knew about as much as he told you, I'm sure. There were things that Bilbo had said to Gandalf that made Gandalf concerned, but seemed of no mind to Bilbo. It seems like he was just thinking it was something in his own mind, saying things like the ring's growing on his mind and he's thinking about it, or saying that sometimes the ring feels like it's changing size or weight and it shrank and expanded in odd ways, became heavier, would slip off your finger if you weren't holding on to it. Things like that, but things that Bilbo was capable of somewhat explaining away in his own mind. Nothing that really gave Bilbo any pause. And Frodo says that Bilbo had warned him about the slipping off the ringer and his slipping off the finger in his last letter, and now Frodo keeps it on a chain. But Frodo, of course, didn't have both of his questions answered with that, so he asks again, how long did you know about this? Gandalf, of course, says that he never really knew, but when he first began to guess was when he felt the power come back into his heart after the White Council drove the darkness out of Mirkwood, which is the same time frame that Frodo found the ring itself. He then got worried when he heard Bilbo's story of how he won the ring and thought that that was completely unbelievable. And so that started to worry him because Bilbo was trying to make his claim to the ring unable to be questioned. And Gandalf thought that that was too close to Gollum's claim of the ring being his birthday present. And that made Gandalf uncomfortable. He said he had always intended to, at some time, talk to Sauron the White about the ring, but something had always held him back. Frodo, of course, asks who Sauron is, and Gandalf explains that he's the leader of the Order of the Wizards. If you've seen the movie, you are aware of who Sauron is. Gandalf also points out that Sauron is the most learned in the lore of these rings of power as well. Gandalf says again that he stopped worrying about the ring because all seemed fine with Bilbo. After a while, he seemed to mellow and normal out, so he didn't really think about it until he started noticing that Bilbo just wasn't changing and that he wasn't aging at all. And that also began to make him worry. He assures Frodo here that there was no permanent harm done, thanks to the point that Bilbo was able to freely give up the ring of his own power. And he also points out that he's the only one of any of the wise who is learned in Hobbit lore, and he finds hobbits to be more sturdy than people give them credit. He does say, though, that of course Bilbo possessed the ring for a very long time, and it may take a while before he's able to really be okay without it, essentially. And he also points out that he believes after a while, Bilbo will live on for many years happily. Just he will live on as if he had just stopped when he was 50, and his years will continue from there, essentially. So, which is what I find very interesting, because in the movie they chose to make Bilbo look older, just not too long after giving up the ring. The thing is, though, if Bilbo aged that quickly after giving up the ring, which, when you think about it, 17 years, he may not have aged that quickly, but it doesn't appear that it's 17 years in the movie, and I don't think they're trying to say it's 17 years in the movie as well. So I don't know. But if Bilbo aged that quickly after giving up the ring, how is Gollum still alive? That's just something I want to bring up, because Gollum would have aged up to what his modern age is, because that's how it is portrayed that Bilbo is aging. Bilbo is aging to an 111-year-old hobbit in that span of time. Gollum would have to age to a multiple thousand-year-old creature. We'll get to that. He would have to age to a multiple thousand-year-old creature in a very short amount of time. So Gollum would be dead, like dust bones. I don't know. It's an interesting but not logically consistent way that the movie portrays one who gives up the ring. Anyway, let's continue on. So Gandalf says he would feel bad. So Gandalf says he has been deeply concerned about Frodo and all these charming, absurd, helpless hobbits. All these stupid, dumb, little, silly creatures. He's concerned for them, about how grievous a blow the dark power would give to all of them in revenge and how they would all essentially become enslaved. Frodo said, why would he want slaves like this, though? And Gandalf says, well, it appears that up until this point, these dark powers had overlooked the Shire, had not thought about you, may not have even known you existed. But now that he does, he may want to exact some sort of revenge. So Frodo says, I still don't understand what's all this got to do with mine and Bilbo's ring, all this revenge talk. And Gandalf tells him, well, it has everything to do with it. Gandalf asks Frodo to give him the ring for just a moment. He holds out his hand. So Frodo takes the ring from his pocket, where it was clasped on a chain, unfastens it, and hesitantly hands the ring over to Gandalf. Gandalf holds up the ring to Frodo and asks, do you see any markings on this whatsoever? Frodo says no. He really even doesn't show any signs of wear whenever I look at it. So then Gandalf says, well, watch this. And he takes it and throws it into the fire. Frodo immediately screams and grabs for the tongs and attempts to try to dig this ring out of his fireplace, but Gandalf holds him back. After a while, it's kind of silent in the room. The only thing that you can hear is the fire crackling and the sound of Sam's shears just outside the window. I wonder why Sam's shears are just outside the window. After a while, Gandalf then picks up the ring and asks Frodo to take it. He says it's quite cool, drops it in Frodo's hands. This is a lot just like how the movie does it. But instead of the movie, there's no slow reveal. Gandalf says, hold it up, look at it closely. And as he does, Frodo sees the inscription show up on both sides of the ring. This inscription right here. Maybe it'll show. There we go. Ashnag Dorbatuluk, Ashnag Krimpatul, Ashnag Thrakatuluk, Ag Borzomishi Krimpatul. It's important to remember, well, not important, but it's fun to remember that Ashnag is one ring. Ashnag. Ashnazg. Sorry. Ashnazg is one ring. Because the word ring in Mordor will be very important later. Frodo tells Gandalf that there are fiery letters that came up, but he can't quite read them. He doesn't know how to. Gandalf says, not many do, but I can. And he says that it comes from the language of Mordor, which I will not utter here, just like the movie. But in the common tongue, this is what is said. Close enough. One ring to rule them all. One ring to find them. One ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. It is 2 lines from a verse long known in Elvish lore. 3 rings to the Elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. In the land of Mordor where the shadow lies, one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadow lies. He paused, and slowly in a deep voice, "This is the Master Ring, the one ring to rule them all." So Frodo's obviously freaking out. Sitting silent and motionless. He kind of reaches out and he imagines that just with learning this information that a giant, dark, shadowy hand is reaching out to him from the east and is just going to grab him and yank him all the way back to Mordor. So he asked Gandalf, how did this possibly come to me? So Gandalf tells him, it's a very long story. If I was going to tell you the entire thing, we would be here for months and months and months, and I'd just be talking the entire time. But he gives him a brief glimpse at it, which we'll go through. He talks of how Sauron had lived in a stronghold in Mirkwood for a while, but the White Council had driven him from it. He returned to Mordor, rebuilt his tower there, and a shadow began growing over the land once again. And it appears that with Sauron's power growing, there will be another attempt of enslavement of the entire world. Frodo says he wishes that this didn't happen in his time, and Gandalf tells him another great line that they used in the movie. "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times. But that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what we do with the time that is given us." So Gandalf effectively tells Frodo at this point that the only thing that Sauron is missing, that this is a reason for them to hope. Because Sauron cannot win unless he has this one ring. So that's kind of like a double-edged sword of giving hope. He then gives Frodo a brief explanation of what happened to the other rings of power. The 3 that were given to the elves, nobody knows where they are, not even Sauron. He wasn't able to corrupt them at all. Gandalf has one. Gandalf has one. There we go, that one's better. Of the 7 rings that were given to the dwarves, 3 of them have been recovered. The other 7 were consumed in dragonfire when the wearers were consumed by dragonfire. So that's exciting. And as far as the 9 go, they have fully been consumed, and they are now fully Sauron's. They are the Ringwraiths, or the Nazgul. You see, it came back. Nazg means ring, and Ghoul means a similar thing to what we know it to mean in modern English. A ghoul is a little ghosty boy, and wraiths are little ghosty boys, and the ring wraiths are ring-bearing ghosty boys. Therefore, they are Nazgûl. Fun. Gandalf then says again that the 3 rings given to the elves are hidden, so those don't really matter to Sauron. And so it is only the 1 ring that really concerns him and what he really wants at this point. Gandalf tells him that Sauron had believed that the 1 ring had vanished, that it had been destroyed, but somehow he is still alive. But now he knows that the ring has not perished, and so it can be reclaimed. Frodo asks, of course, why wasn't the ring destroyed? How did the enemy ever come to lose it? So Gandalf gives a brief story of the Battle of the Last Alliance of Elves and Men. There were the elves and the men of Westerness who came to their aid. On the elvish side, there was Gil-galad, the Elven king, and Elendil of Westerness was on the side of the men, and they overthrew Sauron, but they were cut down and killed in the meantime. And Isildur, Elendil's son, cut the ring from Sauron's hand from his dead corpse. That is different from the movie. It was not cut in an attack. This is literally a trophy that Isildur is taking. He walks up to the corpse of Sauron and cuts the ring from his hand. And Isildur takes it as his own. And from that point on, it had appeared that Sauron's spirit had left Middle-earth altogether. That is, until it came back in the shape of the Necromancer in Mirkwood. But that is slightly getting ahead of the story. So Gandalf goes back to Isildur, and by the great river Anduin, that is where the ring vanished. And the reason it had was as Isildur was riding with a company through the Gladden fields, they were waylaid by orcs. And so Isildur attempted to flee this attack. In doing so, he jumped into the Anduin and was swimming away, and as he swam, the ring grew in size, slipped from his fingers, he became visible, and was killed by the orcs there. And Gandalf says that it is from that point the ring had passed out of the knowledge of the wise. Nobody else knew what had happened. So here Gandalf comes in to attempt to fill in this story. So we'll quote Gandalf right here real quick. Long after, but still very long ago, There lived by the banks of the great river, on the edge of the wilderland, a clever-handed, quiet-footed little people. I guess they were of hobbit kind, akin to the fathers of the stores, for they loved the river, and often swam in it, and made little boats of reeds. I guess they were of hobbit kind, akin to the fathers of the stores. So they are hobbit-like, but not quite what we can recognize as the three, I guess, breeds of hobbits. Not quite hobbits. This, especially in timeline, is similar to comparing humans, or let's say, to comparing Northern Europeans to Neanderthals in genetic makeup, sort. It's relatively a similar time period, or distance in time between the times that we're talking about. And so it's important to keep in mind this is the Third Age. The Third Age. After the Battle of the Last Alliance. We'll go over the timeline more when we get to the last book of the Lord of the Rings, in the appendices there. But it's been thousands of years at this point. Maybe not. Maybe not thousands. It's been well over thousands of years at this point to what time we are at currently in the Third Age. I believe this is in the 3000s. I need to check the timeline. We'll do that later. It doesn't really matter to what I'm speaking to, because this is, again, the Third Age, not the Second Age. Amazon. Let's continue. So Gandalf tells of this family who appears to be the ruling family of this tribe of hobbit-like creatures. This tribe was ruled by a grandmother, and her grandson was one called Smeagol. He appeared to be the most inquisitive and curious-minded of the lot. He was interested in roots and beginnings. He dived into deep pools. He burrowed under trees and growing plants. He tunneled into green mounds, and he ceased to look up at the hilltops or the leaves on trees or the flowers opening in the air. His head and his eyes were downward. So this is a creature that is very interested in roots and beginnings, and later we'll see secrets. He had a friend named Deagle, and Smeagol and Deagle decided to go on a fishing trip on the Anduin near the Gladden Fields. And this occurs just as it does in the beginning of the third movie, the third extended edition, maybe also the third theatrical edition. I don't know. It's been forever since I've watched the theatrical edition. But Deagle is pulled from his boat by a fish. While he is underwater, he sees something glint and shine in the mud. Deagle picks it up, and when he comes up, his hand is full of mud and a ring. Smeagol, of course, wants Deagle to give him the ring. He tells Deagle that it's his birthday and that Deagle should give him the ring because it's his birthday and it would be his birthday present. And Deagle says, no, I've already given you a present, a very expensive one at that. This is mine and I'm going to keep it. So Smeagol kills him and takes the ring himself. And nobody ever finds Deagle's body because it was very cleverly hidden. So nobody ever found it. And Smeagol then put on the ring. And as he put on the ring, he began to walk home. And in walking home, his friends and family could not see him, or at least he realized they could not see him. So he began to get into all sorts of nonsense. The ring had made Smeagol much more keen-eyed and keen-eared, and he would listen only for things that could be used for hurtful purposes. He would attempt to listen in and hurt the people around him with what he heard. He also had developed a sort of gurgle in his mouth, so everybody there had called him Gollum. And they hated Gollum for obvious reasons. He was a terrible creature. So after a while, his grandmother shunned him and he was kicked from their community. Gollum then led a solitary life, traveling down the river, crying about how bad the world is to him. And so what he would do is he would be solitary and he would go and he would try to catch fish with his new invisibility power, and he would catch them and eat them raw. And he would hide from the world. And one day, while he was catching fish in a dark pool, he had the sun beating down on his head. And he hated the sun at this point and cursed it for shining light on all of his evil deeds. So Gollum then decided to follow a river into the mountains and into a cave. And he saw this cave, and he thought to himself, the roots of these mountains must truly be roots themselves. Let's see what secrets are hidden inside these mountains. So he followed them all the way down to a deep, dark, dank pool, where he then lived the rest of his life out there. Frodo at this time catches on to the story. Gollum? Gollum, do you mean the one from Bilbo's story? This is that Gollum? How loathsome. Gandalf says, well, it's a sad story, and I think it could have easily happened to many of the hobbits here, had they been in the same situation. And so Frodo gets a bit racist and says that there's no way that Gollum was like an actual hobbit. Like, there's no way. I refuse to believe that Gollum was a hobbit. Just a tiny bit racist. He calls that an abominable notion. Gandalf says, well, it's absolutely true. You can tell the similarities between he and Bilbo just by the riddles that they told each other, the riddles that they both knew. It seems to be something that was a part of their shared heritage. Frodo's then racist again and says that he couldn't have really been a hobbit because he is a liar and intended to cheat the entire riddle game anyway. And then says that he's sure that Gollum was amused in knowing that the whole game is just a ploy to mess with his next snack. Gandalf, though, thinks that this wasn't really necessarily a ploy. He thinks that Gollum may have actually just been happy to hear somewhat of a pleasant voice talking to him after all these years of him being stuck in a cave by himself. So Gandalf then talks about how, after a while, these secrets that Gollum was hoping to find in the cave turned out to be absolutely nothing. There were no secrets down there worth finding, nothing worth doing, only nasty, furtive eating and resentful remembering. He was altogether wretched. He hated the dark, and he hated the light more. He hated everything, and the ring most of all. So Frodo doesn't necessarily believe that Gollum could possibly hate the ring, but Gandalf then here says a very famous line from the film as well. You ought to begin to understand, Frodo. After all you have heard, said Gandalf, he hates it and loves it, as he hates and loves himself. He could not get rid of it. He had no will left in that matter. Gollum could not get rid of it himself. There's no way. The ring had taken over his mind far too much. It had poisoned him entirely. There was no possible manner of Gollum not loving the ring. The ring made him love it. But the small bit of himself that still remained absolutely hated this thing. So then we have Gandalf telling Frodo that the Ring of Power looks after itself. It had slipped from Isildur's hand at just the right time to kill him and no longer be controlled by him. It had shown itself to Deagle at just the right time, it had then caused Smeagol to kill Deagle. And it also, at just the right time, probably unbeknownst to itself, left Gollum at just the right place in just the right time. And here we can have another line. This one's famously read by Cate Blanchett at the beginning of the first film. It abandoned Gollum, only to be picked up by the most unlikely person imaginable, Bilbo from the Shire. So Gandalf here says that there were other things at work than just the power of the Ringmaker, though. This doesn't seem to be the purpose of the ring to want to be picked up by Bilbo. This seems to be a higher purpose, wanting Bilbo to find the ring, and therefore for Frodo himself to have it. And Gandalf says, I can put it no plainer that by saying that Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its maker. In which case, you also were meant to have it, and that may be an encouraging thought. Frodo, of course, doesn't find that encouraging in the slightest bit. Frodo then asks if Gandalf really does know all of this, or is Gandalf still just guessing? He then says he's not going to give Frodo a full account of all of his doings, but it is clear by the writing on the ring that this ring is the One Ring. And Frodo said, well, when did you figure that out? And he said, just now, in this room, with that test. And he says, then, but I expected to find this. He said this test was the last test to do. He had started guessing with Gollum, but he's not guessing now. And he says he knows this because he had seen Gollum. Frodo, of course, is amazed and doesn't believe that Gandalf had seen Gollum. And Gandalf said, well, yeah, that was the obvious thing to do, was to go find him. So Gandalf tells him that when he found Gollum persisted in the birthday present story, saying that it was from his grandmother, and Gandalf finds that story absolutely ridiculous. He says there's no doubt that Smeagol's grandmother was a matriarch, but powerful or rich and influential enough to possess elven rings, that is absolutely ridiculous. He then says how the murder of Deagle haunted Gollum, and how it was difficult to try to get Smeagol, Gollum, to answer these questions about Deagle, but he eventually got into it with him. Gandalf said he endured Gollum's back and forth manner of speaking as long as he could, but the truth was important, so Gandalf had to put the fear of fire on him. And here's the question: did Gandalf actually torture Smeagol? Did Gandalf threaten to torture Smeagol? This seems a bit out of Gandalf's character, but maybe not. And maybe that's not exactly what he did. Maybe he not so much threatened with like an intent to do it, but threatened. I don't know. It's a good brain teaser to try to figure out. But anyway, through this threat of fire, Gandalf got the story of Gollum's actions after the riddles game. Gollum had thought he had been cheated, so after a year, he decided he was going to go out and get what was his. So, foolishly, Bilbo gave Gollum his actual name. And so, in knowing this, Gollum left the cave and, in the dark, wandered his way through Mirkwood. And through his wanderings in Mirkwood, he had continued and continued until he made his way to Lake Town. And in Lake Town, he had heard tales, so he went all the way to the town of Dale, which is just outside of the Lonely Mountain. And in Dale, he had heard tell of Bilbo Baggins and heard tell of the Shire. And he then began to make his way that way. And just for fun, let me show you these maps. All right. So on this map here, we got over here about, or is it right here? Yeah, it should be right here. Right here about is where Gollum is. This is where he's at. He then crosses the Anduin into Mirkwood. Goes north through Mirkwood all the way to Lake Town, or Esgaroth. And from Esgaroth all the way up to Dale in the Lonely Mountain. And then travels all the way back through Mirkwood. So Gandalf says that he knows that Gollum made it through Mirkwood because he himself saw Gollum there. So again, after leaving Dale, Gollum went west again in an attempt to find the Shire. But at the Great River, he decided to go south for whatever reason. At this point, it's not been mentioned. And Gandalf says he knows this because he had the Wood Elves track him, and they did until they had lost contact with their woodland furry creatures that they can talk to, and they stopped getting news of Gollum because he had gone so far south out of their reach. And so Gandalf decided to give up the task of tracking him for a while, until a couple years ago, at this point in the story, he decided to re-pick up the trail, though it had gone very cold, and he had the greatest tracker in this age of the world, Aragorn, go try to hunt down Gollum. They were tracking Gollum until they just about gave up and moved on with their lives when Aragorn finally found Gollum and brought him to Gandalf. Where Gollum had been, he was not going to tell them, and he was licking his fingers as if they pained him, as if he remembered some old torture. But Gandalf says he's afraid there's no doubt in his mind that Gollum had been to the land of Mordor, and in doing so, told the two things that he knows. The room fell silent with this. Not even the sound of Sam's shears could be heard. So again, Gandalf confirms from Gollum visiting, the enemy has learned that the ring is still here, still undestroyed, and that it has been kept for some years in the land called the Shire by a hobbit with the last name of Baggins. So at this point, Frodo says the very famous line, "What a pity that Bilbo did not stab that vile creature when he had a chance." And Gandalf says the even more famous line, "Pity? It was pity that stayed his hand, pity and mercy, not to strike without need. And he has been well rewarded, Frodo. Be sure that he took so little hurt from the evil and escaped in the end, because he began his ownership of the ring so, with pity." This is, of course, pointing out that since Bilbo began in owning the ring with this in mind, not killing Gollum when he clearly easily had a chance to do so, that he began with a good heart, the ring had little to grip onto in terms of evil, and an evil way to manipulate Bilbo. we have, again, another very famous line from the movie. Frodo says that Gollum deserves death, and Gandalf replies, "Deserves it? I dare say he does. Many that live deserve death, and some that die deserve life. Can you give it to them? Then do not be too eager to deal out death and judgment, for even the wise cannot see all ends. I have not much hope that Gollum can be cured before he dies, but there is a chance of it, and he is bound up with the fate of the ring. My heart tells me that he has some part to play yet, for good or ill, before the end, and when that comes, the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many." Frodo again, still complaining. All the same, I wish that Bilbo hadn't kept the ring. Why me? Why'd it come to me, huh? I don't want this. Why did it come to me? And then he starts blaming Gandalf for this. Why did you let me keep it? Why didn't you make me throw it away? Gandalf, of course, points out why this line of questioning is stupid. There's nothing that Gandalf could have done. And at this point, he asks Frodo to try to throw it away. He goes, "Have you ever tried? Try now. Do it." So Frodo takes the ring out of his pocket and looks at it, and he starts staring at it and how beautiful it is, how smooth and how flawless this ring really is. And he takes it and he makes an effort to throw it, makes the motion, and in doing so finds himself putting it right back inside of his pocket. Gandalf, of course, laughs at this, points out to Frodo, "You see, you can't do it, and nothing I can do can make you do that." He then tells him that your small fire isn't even enough to melt regular gold, let alone this ring. This ring can't even be unmade with dragon's fire. Even Ankelagon the Black, which is the largest dragon in Tolkien's Legendarium, he says even Ankelagon the Black could not melt this. This ring can only be unmade in Mount Doom, where it was forged. Frodo then says, "I do really wish it to be destroyed, or, well, to have it destroyed." Then it says, why was I chosen? Why me? Again. And Gandalf replies in a very funny way. This one just has to be quoted. "Such questions cannot be answered," said Gandalf. "You may be sure it was not for any merit that others do not possess. Not for power or wisdom at any rate. But you have been chosen, and you must therefore use such strength and heart and wits you have." So Gandalf tells him, it's not because you have anything great that other people have, and it's definitely not because you're smart or because you're strong. In an attempt to build him up, what you do is you just make him feel like a small, stupid idiot. So at this point, Frodo does the famous thing and offers the ring to Gandalf, and Gandalf, of course, says no, absolutely not. I would take the ring with the desire to do good, but through me, horrible things will happen. And at this point, Gandalf decides, well, all the dark, crazy stuff of this conversation is kind of going by the wayside, so I'm going to go and I'm going to open the window. So he goes and opens the blinds and opens the window, and he says, something must be done soon. The enemy is moving. There was a long silence, long enough for Gandalf to pull out his pipe and begin smoking. So Frodo's sitting there, worried, thinking about the cracks of doom and the fire, and not really wanting to go along with this. It kind of was freaking him out. Gandalf asks him, what's he thinking about? What are you going to do? And he asks Frodo if he's decided what he's going to do. Frodo answers no, and through thinking about the darkness, he then turns and sees the sun up and bright outside, sees the nice spring morning, and decides to say, well, I don't know. Maybe, perhaps. He says he supposes he must keep the ring to guard it, at least for the present. Gandalf reassures him that if the ring's going to do anything to you, it's going to be slow. It's not going to be a rapid, crazy process of you turning evil. It moves slowly. Frodo then begins thinking, and he tells Gandalf he would like to save the Shire. He's felt for a while that a lot of its residents are dull and boring, and he feels like an invasion of dragons would probably be good for them. But now, facing what he's facing now, he recants that and thinks that he just wants to do what's best, and he wants to save the Shire. And he also... He didn't tell Gandalf this, but inside of him, he had this buildup of energy of wanting to just run out the door and forget his handkerchief like Bilbo did, and he wants to go on this adventure to hopefully see Bilbo again as well in the process. And we have, again, a very famous line from the movies. "My dear Frodo," exclaimed Gandalf, "hobbits really are amazing creatures. As I have said before, you can learn all that there is to know of their ways in a month, and yet, after 100 years, they can still surprise you in a pinch." Gandalf says he hardly expected this answer from Frodo, but he asked it anyway, which is an interesting thing to think about with their relationship, their dynamic together. And Gandalf at this point gives Frodo his assumed name that he will be having for the rest of his time on this journey, Mr. Underhill, which I don't know how many of you did the same thing, but of course my first introduction to The Lord of the Rings was from the movie when I was very young, and whenever Frodo gave his name at the Prancing Pony as Underhill, I had never heard Underhill. It'd always sound like a more slurred version, which I never knew what exactly he was saying. I just knew it was neither Baggins, and it didn't sound to me like Underhill. So when I first read these books, when I was 16 years old, well over 10 years ago now, So when I first read these books, well over 10 years ago now, I read the name Underhill, And it finally clicked in my head, and it made so much sense. I don't know if anyone else has experienced that, but that is my experience with the name Underhill. Gandalf tells Frodo also that he should not go alone. And here we have a very funny transition. Just in telling Frodo that he should not go alone, Gandalf tells him, "But if you look for a companion, be careful in choosing, and be careful of what you say, even to your closest friends. The enemy has many spies and many ways of hearing." Suddenly, he stopped, as if listening, for he became aware that all was very quiet, inside and out. Gandalf crept to the window, to one side of the window. Then, with a dart, he sprang to the sill and thrust his long arm out. And downward there was a squawk, and up came Sam Gamgee's curly head, hauled by one ear. I find it very funny that we have this entire time of they're talking about, well, you gotta choose somebody, but you gotta be careful, and Gandalf's telling them, at this time, the enemy has many ways of hearing. And just outside is Sam Gamgee listening. And so what we have next is Gandalf, of course, scolding Sam, but later we'll see Frodo laughing. And I don't know if Frodo laughing is out of, like, relief. And I don't know if Frodo laughing is out of relief or out of, like, genuinely finding this funny. Now Gandalf's asking Sam what he's been doing, and Sam says that he's just been trimming the grass border under the window. And he holds up his shears to be like, look, this is what I've been doing. And Gandalf doesn't believe him. He said they haven't heard the sound of his shears for quite a while. And he asks Sam if he's been eavesdropping. And so the line that you might have in your head if you have seen the movies is you hear Sean Astin saying, "I ain't been dropping no eaves, sir, honest," which I find to be a very funny line. But I'm going to posit that Sam's response in the book may just be funnier. So Gandalf says, "How long have you been eavesdropping?" Not even asking have you been eavesdropping? He's positing, you have been eavesdropping. "How long have you been eavesdropping?" Sam replies, "Eavesdropping, sir? I don't follow you, begging your pardon. There ain't no eaves at Bag End, and that's a fact." In both ways, you have Gandalf saying eavesdropping, and its idiomatic expression, which is more of this metaphorical sense of the term eavesdropping. You're not thinking of literal eaves when you're eavesdropping. You are just thinking of someone secretly listening in on a conversation. Sam in the movie replies in an equally idiomatic way, but in a way that makes it seem like he doesn't quite understand the idiom, but he gets what Gandalf is trying to say. "Have you been eavesdropping? I ain't been dropping no eaves." Essentially telling Gandalf that he wasn't doing what he's accusing him of doing. Sam in the book just tries to change the entire topic. Gandalf says, "How long have you been eavesdropping?" And Sam says, "There are no eaves at Bag End," and everyone knows that. I just think that changing of the topic is a very funny way of getting around the idea of being guilty of listening in on a conversation. I don't know. I think the book version's funnier. You're more than welcome to disagree with me. So we have Sam begging Gandalf to not turn him into anything unnatural, as he does in the movie. Frodo's laughing here now, seeing Sam groveling. And Sam said he had made a noise when he heard that Frodo was going away, and it made him sad. He tells him, "I listened because I couldn't help. If you know what I mean. Lord bless me, sir, but I do love tales of that sort, and I believe them too, whatever Ted may say. Elves, sir, I would dearly love to see them. Couldn't you take me to see elves, sir, when you go?" We have here a fun quote from Sam, which may put into perspective what Sam's priorities are here, and where his mind is in thinking of him when he wants to go on this journey. "Well, sir," said Sam, dithering a little, "I heard a deal that I don't rightly understand about an enemy and rings and Mr. Bilbo, sir, and dragons and fiery mountains and elves, sir. I listened because I couldn't help myself, if you know what I mean. Lord bless me, sir, but I do love tales of that sort, and I believe them too, whatever Ted may say. Elves, sir, I would dearly love to see them. Couldn't you take me to see elves, sir, when you go?" That I find interesting for a number of reasons. First off, with the more interesting take, this is another example of people saying that this is anachronism in Tolkien. The anachronism here being Sam saying, "Lord bless me," where we are living in a world that, according to Tolkien in his own way of ordering the world, this is pre-Christ and, well, pre-Bible. So these Northern European-esque people would not know of God and would not refer to him as Lord. But the argument posited against that is that he's obviously not talking about the Lord, he's talking about a Lord. And hobbits would have an idea of a Lord being a ruler over people. In this same paragraph, though, we have something else that's interesting, is thrice we have Sam saying, "Elves, sir," which I find interesting. This kind of shows where Sam's head is at and what he wants to accomplish on this journey. And you will see this later on in the book. It'll be mentioned again. Sam really wants to see elves, and that's really one of the big things that's like pushing him onto this journey. It's also interesting because though Sam is significantly younger than Frodo, they both grew up with these stories of elves from hearing Bilbo tell them. And it's kind of a I don't want to say communal, but a similar thing that the two of them have in common. Both of them have experienced this storytelling of Bilbo, of elves, and this is something that they're both interested in. And so in him mentioning elves, but also directing them at Frodo, "Elves, sir," is, I find it interesting as a dynamic of their relationship. So Sam, of course, asks if Frodo has to go, and Frodo says it can't be helped. And he tells Sam that he must keep this an absolute secret and cannot breathe a word to anybody here. And he tells him that if he speaks a word of it, he hopes that Gandalf turns him into a frog in a garden full of snakes. And so Sam falls to his knees, freaking out, kind of scared. Also feels bad because he's worried that he'll let down his master. And Gandalf tells him to get up. And he says he has a better idea. And he says something to shut your mouth and punish you properly for listening. You will go away with Mr. Frodo. And Sam, of course, is very excited and shouts, "Me, sir!" And he cries and springs up like a dog invited for a walk. Me? Go and see elves? So again, we have Sam mentioning his excitement for seeing elves. And with that, Sam burst into tears. And we have finished chapter 2. I, of course, again, intend to do this with all of the Lord of the Rings books, but I wish to do this with a whole lot more books. I have a decently growing library of books that I feel that a lot of people are not regularly exposed to. My field of study and research is in medieval literature, and I would really enjoy, because I've been doing some searching and Googling on YouTube and stuff like that, whether there are places that break down medieval stories. Let me really quick. So, right here, we have Chrétien de Troyes, his Arthurian romances. These are written in the 1300s. We have the most influential book of modern Western philosophy, Boethius, the Consolation of Philosophy. We can go through Dante Alighieri's Inferno. Look at Chaucer's short stories and poems on dream visions. The works of Thomas Hoccleve. Just Middle English Breton lays. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And Thomas Mallory's Le Morte d'Arthur. There is a plethora of medieval literature that's not being presented in a very digestible manner. And I am hoping with this channel to attempt to do that, to take these books and to give you an example of the writing. For example, the general prologue. Juanata Puelo with his shorta sota and drops of march had person to the rota, and battered every vine in sweet liqueur, of which vertu engendered is the fleur, when Zephyrus equity sweated breath and spirit hath in every holten heath, the tender corpus, the young son, hath in the ram his half core ziron. I want to make stuff like that easier for the layman to get into this stuff. I want to take this Middle English and attempt to make it easier for people to approach it. So that is my plan with this channel. We'll do the Lord of the Rings, and if by then I have a decent following, I can start doing voting on what books we could look at next. I have a semi-plan in my head, but of course I would like to start with what I have in my library, both there and there. Of course, there's a lot more medieval texts over there. I just wanted to grab everything from there at first. With that, like and subscribe, and hopefully you can see a lot more of this. Thank you.